Welcome back to 50 Fundamental Chain Reaction Mechanisms. This is episode 5 in the series, and we'll be covering weight management. But if you haven't seen the previous episodes, I recommend that you catch up. You can click right here to go watch them. Starting out simple, the next mechanism on our list is the weight slide. Back in episode 1, we talked about the weight and string mechanism, and by and large, this is a pretty much fail-proof technique, but occasionally there is one way that you can get unlucky. Sometimes you might have a track that doesn't quite reach the end of the table, and after a few tests you might conclude, oh, I guess it works just fine. But occasionally you will get an unlucky bounce. So yes, the solution to this issue is pretty straightforward. Simply add a slope so that the weight will slide off the table instead of relying on the weight to make a lucky bounce every single time. But the key takeaway here, really, is learning to recognize the situations where using this mechanism would be useful, because it's always worth it to increase the reliability of your machines, especially when it means just adding one more block. Number 42, shock absorber. First off, I want to say that the shock absorber is quite possibly my favorite mechanism on this entire list, because it single-handedly solves 3 pretty significant problems. It's easy to make, it doesn't take up that much space, and it's not visually distracting. Traditionally, the way you would stop an object is simply by adding a barrier, but when you have an object moving really fast, or an object that's very heavy, or worse, both, a straight-up barrier sometimes isn't enough. In other words, the closer you get to an unstoppable force, the harder it is to make an unmovable object. So there are 3 main problems with just a regular barrier that the shock absorber is designed to solve. The first is the problem that I alluded to, which is that it's basically impossible to make an unmovable object, and barriers will just come unglued if you hit them hard enough. The second problem is that at high enough speeds, the barrier will not be able to soak up all of that impact, and since the energy has to go somewhere, that just results in the object bouncing back. And in previous episodes we have looked at possible ways of addressing this problem, for instance with magnets, but at high enough speeds that just doesn't work. Finally, even if you manage to make an unmovable barrier and somehow prevent the object from bouncing backwards, you're still going to have to deal with the third problem with using just a regular, straightforward barrier: vibrations. Because if you're not allowing the barrier to soak up the impact by, moving, and you're also not allowing the object itself to soak up the impact by bouncing backwards, well, the only thing left to soak up the impact is the table itself, which will cause vibrations throughout the entire machine. And you can imagine why that would be a problem. So what is a shock absorber? Well, its ultimate purpose is to slow down and stop an object. The shock absorber is able to do this by spreading out the impact force of the object over a larger distance, and instead of the object coming to a stop immediately, it's able to decelerate slowly by transferring its energy into a movable barrier rather than a static one. What I really love about the shock absorber, though, is its simplicity. In its most basic form, it's 2 parts: a connex rod and a connector. And because this is connex we're talking about, you can of course customize the shock absorber to suit your needs by changing anything from the length of the rod to the number of connectors or the number of rods, or a combination of those changes. And you can even get really specific with the shock absorber by adding spacers to the end to mark out exactly how far you need to load it for every reset. So let's take a look at some more examples of how a shock absorber can be used, starting off with the very trick that led to the invention of the shock absorber, the dump truck from Kern Center machine. It can also be used to slow down not just linear motion, but rotational motion. And we've already seen the shock absorber at least a couple of times in this very series, like this example from episode 3, where it's used to slow down a falling track. And to really drive the point home about how useful the shock absorber can be, I want to take you behind the scenes a little bit and show you a problem that I was having with an example that I built for episode 4. Sometimes when 2 objects collide with each other, it can have strange results, like this red ball that seemed to want to bounce out on every single test because of the vibrations that were traveling through the falling track. But thanks to the shock absorber, I was able to solve this problem with just 2 connex pieces and some glue. And in my opinion, it's a really elegant solution. It basically took no time at all and was super easy to make. It takes up barely any space, and it's not visually overwhelming. You barely even see it. Number 43, discarded weight. A discarded weight is a weight that's temporarily attached to an object that falls off of the object, or disconnects, automatically. So here we have the basic bare bones structure of a tilting board trick. And right away we have an issue. The first ball isn't heavy enough to tilt the board. Okay, simple enough solution. We add some more weight to the left side. But it seems that now we've accidentally created a different problem, where the board is now too heavy on the left, and the second ball isn't heavy enough to tilt the board to the right. Ideally, what we want is just a little bit of extra weight on the left side to help the first ball tilt the board to the left. But once the board tilts, we don't actually need that weight anymore, because the ball is actually heavy enough by itself to hold the board in that position. To solve this problem, we can just make one small adjustment by converting the weight into a discarded weight that will automatically fall off the board when it tilts to the left side. Let's take a look at another completely different example, this time with a large rolling disc. We want the disc to get all the way to the right side of the table, but you can see that it doesn't have enough energy yet to get there. One thing we might try to do is add some weight to the outside of the disc, so that as the disc rolls forward, the weight travels downward, making the disc roll faster, and hopefully giving it enough energy to get to the other side of the table. But very quickly, we realize the downside to this approach, which is that once the weight reaches the bottom of its rotation, it then has to get lifted back up again as the disc continues rolling, which counteracts any initial benefit that it might have had. What the discarded weight allows us to do is attach the weight to the disc only for the time that it's traveling downwards, giving the disc extra force. But once the weight reaches its bottommost point, it disconnects automatically, eliminating the need for it to get lifted back up again as the disc continues rolling. Some of you may even recognize this exact mechanism from when I used it in 8-ball machines with this rolling disc. Next on our list, we're finally getting to the mechanism that I've been using many times in previous examples throughout this series, but never mentioned explicitly: the off-table weight. Instead of a weight falling off the table in order to pull something, the off-table weight is a weight that's already hanging off the table and is simply released. The off-table weight eliminates the sudden jolt of energy that occurs when the weight reaches the end of the string, and instead allows for a much smoother, much steadier motion with a more consistent speed overall. So let's take a look at another example. Here we have a pulley system that's supposed to lift a track with a ball on it. And all we have to do to lift the track is pull on the string. So let's try this with a weight and string mechanism and see what happens. As you can see, the problem that we're having here is that the track is lifting too quickly. It's basically launching the ball instead of simply tilting the track. And on top of that, this is a pretty violent motion. It's putting quite a bit of strain on the machine, specifically the hot glue. And if we were to run this enough times, something is bound to break. Now, you might assume that the weight itself is the problem, that it's too heavy, but you'll see in just a second that that's actually not the issue. The real problem is that sudden jolt of energy that happens when it reaches the end of the string. So let's revisit that same example and implement a few changes. The first is that the weight that pulls on the lifting track will start by hanging off the table this time. And we're going to hold the lifting track in the downward position using a Connex rod lock. And we're going to release the Connex rod lock using a weight and string. And look at what a difference it makes. Silky smooth motion, very consistent speed, and no chance of the ball ever launching out of the track. What's more, we're putting very minimal strain on the machine's components, making this a very reliable and, importantly, repeatable motion, where we don't have to worry about the machine deteriorating over time. There are multiple different ways of implementing the off-table weight, and we just saw an example where you hold back the object that's going to move. But that might not be a viable option in your situation. So let's take a look at some ways of holding back the weight itself, or more accurately, the string. And the best way to hold a string is by using a clothespin, which looks like this. You may have noticed that when the string is held by the clothespin, it's actually pulled out of line slightly to the left, and when the string gets released, it snaps back to the right, forming a straight line again. And this is intentional. Not to get too technical, but the spring inside a clothespin is actually decently strong, and you'd need quite a bit of force to hold a clothespin open. So we're not going to bother doing that. We're just going to have the clothespin open for a split second and allow the string to slide out. But in order for the string to slide out, there needs to be some kind of force pulling it out of the mouth of the clothespin, and that's why we slide the string to the side. Because if that force isn't there, the clothespin just simply re-grips the string again, defeating the whole purpose of the clothespin release. Finally, one last tip for this technique: if you're using a really heavy weight, you might have some difficulty getting the clothespin to grip the string. So one thing you can do is simply add a knot to the string to prevent the string from sliding through the mouth of the clothespin. Now that I think about it, it might even be possible to use a string stopper for this, using the method that I mentioned in episode 3, because that would allow a bit more flexibility with the exact positioning of the stopping point, since obviously you can't just slide a knot along a string. So maybe that's something to experiment with. Next, let's take a look at a slightly different method of using a clothespin to release an off-table weight. This time by extending the string after the point that the weight is attached and looping that string back up to the table to grip it with a clothespin. Depending on your specific context, this might be a more practical solution based on where you have room to build something or what other connections are in the surrounding area. The list goes on. Lastly, there is one kind of subcategory of off-table weight that works slightly differently than the other types. In this version, you have an off-table weight pulling on an object that's almost heavy enough to move it, but not quite. In other words, nothing will move by itself. Unlike the other examples that we just looked at, nothing needs to be held in place. You don't need a clothespin to hold the string, you don't need a connects rod lock to hold the object. It's stable. The trick here is that now you've made a system where the object can be moved with a very small amount of force. By just pushing it slightly, you're putting it into a position where the off-table weight can pull it the rest of the way. Number 45, limited weight pull. In the off-table weight examples that we just saw, the weight and the object being pulled by the weight always stop at the same time. In other words, the weight will continue to pull the object until the object stops. But with a limited weight pull, the weight only pulls for a certain distance before a string stopper or a second shorter string catches the weight and prevents it from pulling any further, while still allowing the object being pulled to continue moving. This mechanism is usually used in cases where you need a lot of weight to get an object to start moving, but after a certain point, the object will continue moving by itself, and the weight needs to disconnect or stop pulling, or else the object will gain way too much speed or way too much power. So what does any of that actually look like? Well, here's an example of an off-table weight being used to pull a flexing parallelogram to a new position. Notice how even though the flexing parallelogram starts moving slowly, by the time it reaches its destination, it's going super fast. So fast, in fact, that it actually breaks the pulley. What would be great is if we could have the off-table weight pull on the flexing parallelogram only to get it to start moving, but once it gets to about halfway, it would stop pulling. Because at that point, the flexing parallelogram has enough energy to continue moving, and after a certain point, even the force of gravity is enough to get it to fall into its second position. And that's exactly what the limited weight pull does. You can see this is a much more peaceful motion. And the secret to this motion is this string stopper placed at the exact perfect position on the string, so that once the flexing parallelogram gets to about halfway, the string stopper gets stuck in the pulley, preventing the weight from falling any further. You may have noticed that this is a modified version of the pulley module that I showed in episode 3, and I've found that this is the perfect way of making limited weight pulls because of that added crossbar at the top that the string stopper gets stuck behind. Another application of the limited weight pull is to eliminate the strain of an off-table weight pulling on an object even after it's arrived in its final position. We've actually already seen an example of the limited weight pull being used for this back in episode 3. By leaving the weight just hanging off the table, that's putting a lot of unnecessary strain on the string wrapped around the wheel. But by adding a limited weight pull, by connecting a string from the pulley to the weight, we can stop the weight just a little bit earlier, eliminating the strain that it's adding to the wheel. Let's say you have a situation where you need quite a bit of weight to get an object to start moving, but after a certain point, you don't need all that weight. But you do still need some weight. Well, the limited weight pull doesn't account for this. You either have all the weight or none of the weight. There's no, dividing the weight in half after a certain point or something. So is there a way to do that? Well, the answer is yes, and that's what the dual limited weight pull is designed to do. So here's how the dual limited weight pull works, and bear with me. You've got two weights. The first is attached at the end of the string, just like a regular off-table weight. The second weight is allowed to slide along that string, and it's attached by a second string to the table. At the beginning, both weights fall down at the same rate, but at a certain point, the second weight, the sliding weight, reaches the length of its string and stops falling, and the first weight is allowed to continue falling. So to recap, the dual limited weight pull is used in cases where you need some amount of weight to get an object to start moving, but then only a fraction of that weight to get it to continue moving. And you do this by having two separate weights that stop falling at different times. So let's build up a situation where you might need to use a dual limited weight pull. We'll start with just a regular pulley-powered ball lift that uses an off-table weight. Our first problem is that even though the off-table weight provides a reasonable amount of force to get the ball lift to start lifting, once the ball lift nears the top of its rotation, it's going way too fast. It has so much speed and so much power that the ball completely misses the track and the top of the ball lift breaks off. So we need some way of preventing the weight from pulling throughout the entire duration of the ball lift's rotation. And the first thing we might try to do is make a limited weight pull. But you can see that all that does is immediately stop the ball lift as soon as the string stopper gets stuck in the pulley. It's just not one of those cases where the object will continue moving by itself. It does still need some amount of force to keep it going. So the next step to solve that problem is to make this a dual limited weight pull. And this works perfectly. You can see that the combined weight provides enough force to get the ball lift to start moving, but after a certain point, only the smaller weight is needed to get the ball lift to continue moving. And this isn't super necessary because we already solved this problem effectively with the limited weight pull, but the dual limited weight pull can also be used to solve that problem that we were having in the example before with the flexing parallelogram. So far, in the last few mechanisms, we've been looking at methods of keeping an object's speed under control. But what if you need to actively slow an object down? Well, there's a way to do that too, which leads us to our next mechanism, the delayed weight lift. You can almost think of the delayed weight lift as almost a reverse limited weight pull, because the setup is pretty much the same. You have an off-table weight that goes through a pulley, and a string stopper attached to the string that gets stuck inside the pulley. Except this time, everything's reversed. So the string stopper starts out stuck inside the pulley, and as the object moves, after a certain point, it starts to lift the weight. So let's go back to that ball lift example. You'll remember the problem we were originally having was that the ball lift gained too much speed as it lifted. So let's go back and start from scratch, from that point, and let's develop an alternate solution to that problem. Previously, we solved this problem with a dual limited weight pull by decreasing the amount of weight pulling on the ball lift about halfway through its lifting motion. But another approach might be to add a second weight that works against the first, in the opposite direction. And here's what the delayed weight lift looks like. Just like before, the ball lift slows down around halfway through its rotation, but this time it's because it's lifting a weight on the left side, which counteracts the weight that's falling on the right, causing the ball lift to slow down. Here's a close-up of how this actually works. You can see the string stopper starts by being stuck inside the pulley module, but after a certain distance it gets pulled out to lift the weight. And this is what I meant when I said the delayed weight lift is kind of a reverse limited weight pull. The important thing to realize is that you can slow down a moving object by counteracting the force of the falling off-table weight that's pulling on it by making that object lift a secondary weight after a certain distance. Finally, here's yet another example of the delayed weight lift in action, this time being used to, again, solve the problem we were having with the flexing parallelogram. I'll be honest, the delayed weight lift is not one of the easier mechanisms on this list. For that matter, to some extent, you could say the same of the limited weight pull and the dual limited weight pull, because it requires a lot of precise calibration and figuring out exactly how much weight to put on one side and the exact amount of weight for the other side and the exact location of the string stopper and so on. But it is a worthwhile mechanism to learn, and I'm confident that if you play around with it, you'll be able to figure it out too. Number 48, shifting weight. A shifting weight is a weight that slides along a rod to help with tilting an object. And it's also able to keep that tilting object stable in each position because instead of making one side of the tilting object permanently heavier, we just make whichever side is lower heavier by making the shifting weight shift to that side. Take a look at this trick here. We've got two tracks, one on each end of the seesaw. And here's what we want to do. We want each track to stay in place when a lighter wooden ball rolls over them, but we also want each track to tilt downwards when a heavier billiard ball rolls over them. To establish a baseline, let's just see what happens as is. Well, looks like the wooden ball is heavy enough to tilt the track. So let's add some more weight to the right side. Okay, great. It looks like the wooden ball makes it to the other side now without tilting the track. And good news, the billiard ball works too, tilting the track just like we wanted. Except the track doesn't stay there, it just lifts back up again, which makes sense. I mean, we did add more weight to the right side of the seesaw. So this won't work, because we want this motion to be repeatable on the right side, and we can't roll the wooden ball over the track if the track's not there. So it looks like more adjustments are needed. How about adding more weight to the left side so that the track will stay in the downward position? But that just balances the seesaw again, so we're pretty much back at square one. This is the situation that a shifting weight is built for. Yes, the example is a little contrived, but the important point is that sometimes we need to have a tilting object that requires the same amount of force to tilt it in both directions. But we also want the tilting object to be stable in both tilted positions. So, in effect, we need a way of repeatedly adjusting which side of the object is heavier. So here's the seesaw trick with the shifting weight mechanism implemented. The wooden ball isn't able to tilt the track, but the billiard ball is. And then, repeat on the other side. Next, I want to show you an example that at first doesn't even seem like it would count as a shifting weight, but is in fact a completely valid application of this mechanism. When the domino falls onto the right side of the ball lift, it pushes that side down slightly, causing the shifting weight, in this case the ball, to shift to that side. So effectively what we've done is generated enough force to bounce the ball across the table from just the small input force of a domino falling over. And this is just one example of an entire other application of the shifting weight, where you can take a very small input force and convert it into a potentially very large output force. Number 49, magnetic weight addition. A magnetic weight addition is when a magnetic object moves into a certain position so that it can connect with a magnet, which provides extra weight. Here's a very simple automatically resetting ball dropper trick. This works because the weight at the bottom is heavier than the empty cup, but lighter than the cup with the ball in it. So what happens is when the ball enters the cup, the top of the ball dropper becomes heavier. So that shift in weight distribution, along with the ball's momentum, causes the ball dropper to fall to the right. And then when the ball exits the cup, the left side becomes heavier again, causing the ball dropper to reset itself. Okay, so that's that. But what if we want to make this work with a ping pong ball? Well, looks like we need to make some adjustments. So to start off, the first thing we're going to do is remove as much weight as possible from the bottom, leaving only enough to keep the ball dropper in this initial position. Let's see what happens now. Ball enters, cup tilts, but the ball dropper doesn't return to its original position. Obviously, we need to add more weight to the bottom, but let's be a bit more careful this time around and calibrate the weight a little more precisely. You can see here that the weight we're adding is just heavy enough to lift the cup when it's in the downward position. And this should definitely work, right? We've seen how the weight is heavier than the empty cup because it's able to return the ball lift to its original position. And because we were very careful about making it just heavy enough, it should still be lighter than the cup with the ball in it. So why is it doing this? The secret is that the weight distribution is not the full story here. I glossed over it a little bit, but one of the reasons the billiard ball works is that when it enters the cup, it has momentum, and it pushes the ball dropper slightly to the right, until it gets to a point where the weight difference can take over and make the ball dropper fall the rest of the way. But with a ping pong ball, you just don't get that. The ball's too light. It doesn't have enough momentum. When it enters the cup, it doesn't push the ball dropper to the right at all. So while yes, it's true that the cup with the ball in it is heavier than the weight on the other side, the ping pong ball doesn't enter the cup with enough momentum to tilt the ball dropper enough to make that difference in weight meaningful. So it just doesn't move at all. Hopefully it's clear at this point that there is no amount of weight that we can attach to the bottom of the ball dropper so that it will work with a ping pong ball. It can't be done, unless we use a magnetic weight addition. And here's how the magnetic weight addition can be used to solve this problem. You can see what we're effectively doing here is automatically changing how heavy the bottom of the ball dropper is. We start off with only the weight of a magnet at the bottom of the ball dropper. So the ping pong ball enters the cup, and the cup tilts. Then, when the ball dropper's in the downward position, a magnetic ball connects to the magnet, causing the bottom of the ball dropper to be heavier, and causing it to reset itself. There's another application of the magnetic weight addition that's a little bit weird and much different than what we've looked at so far. Sometimes, if you have an object that's being pulled, and that object is getting heavier as it moves, maybe it's grabbing objects along the way or something, then you might need increasingly heavy weight to continue pulling that object at a consistent speed. So what you can do is use an off-table weight, and when the weight falls to a certain position, it connects to a magnet on it that's sitting maybe on the side of the table somehow or on some kind of platform. And this is exactly the technique that I used in this clip from Dominoes vs. Machines round 6. Because the rotating gear is picking up more and more track segments as it moves, it's getting heavier, so I needed more weight on the wrench to continue moving it. So I built this platform with a magnet on it that would connect to the wrench once it fell to a certain point. Finally, the last mechanism on our list, number 50, the intermittent weight pull. The intermittent weight pull is like a limited weight pull if you could then release the weight and allow it to fall and pull the object for a second time. In other words, this is where you have a weight that pulls an object for a certain distance, and then the string stopper on the string gets caught, and then, sometime later, the string stopper gets released again, allowing the weight to pull the object for a second time. So again, let's take a look at an example and build up a situation so you can see what kind of circumstances require an intermittent weight pull. Here we have a tilting track mounted on some vertical sliders, and here's what we want to do. We want the track to start sloped to the right, and then tilt so that it's sloped to the left. And we want to do this in both positions, both at the top and at the bottom. And you can see there's a string attached to the left side of the track, and that's the mechanism that will be continually adjusting as we build up this situation. We're starting out with just a regular off-table weight. So the string goes down and then through a pulley where it connects to a weight hanging off the table. With just a regular off-table weight, the track actually does work at the top level. It tilts from the right to the left, but when the track falls down, it's already tilted to the left because of the off-table weight that's pulling on that side. So then you might think, great, we'll just try a limited weight pull. That way, the top will work as normal, but then when the track falls down, the string isn't pulling on the left side anymore. And indeed, that is what happens. The top works perfectly, and when the track falls, it's tilted to the right this time. But sadly, the track is now stuck here, because the string is stuck inside the pulley, and the weight can't be pulled on any further to tilt the track back to the left. What we need is a string that can pull on the left side of the track initially, so that the track tilts at the top, but then stops pulling so that the track can tilt to the right when it gets to the bottom, but then pull on the track again to get it to tilt to the left at the bottom. And here's what that looks like. This is the intermittent weight pull. Here's a close-up of everything that's going on here. The string stopper moves initially as the track tilts to the left at the top, and then gets caught behind this connects rod. That allows the track to tilt to the right when it falls to the bottom. And then the string stopper gets released by the connects rod sliding to the side, allowing the weight to continue pulling on the track, tilting it back to the left at the bottom. So there's a lot going on in this mechanism. And I admit it's not something you'll use every day. Myself, I've probably only used it a couple of times. But when those fringe cases come up, you'll be glad you know how to make it. So those are the weight management techniques. And in fact, that's the end of the list. Those are the 50 fundamental chain reaction mechanisms. So I hope this series was useful or entertaining, and most importantly, regardless if you're a beginner or an expert, I hope you learned something. I put a lot of work into building all of the examples in this series and figuring out the clearest possible way of demonstrating each of these mechanisms and all the different applications that they can have and all the different forms that they can take and all the different problems that might come up and the solutions to those problems. So I hope it was worth it. So that's the end of the series. If you want to check out some of my actual machines, you can click the playlist on the left. If you liked the series, leave a comment down below telling me what you thought. And if you want to subscribe to my channel, you can click the icon on the right. I'm Jack of All Spades 98, and I'll see you in the next video.